Hello and welcome back. In today's video, we shall see how you can build a hybrid cloud data center with FlexPod and NetApp Cloud Volumes ONTAP. With the data fabric powered by NetApp, you can connect your on-premises FlexPod to Google Cloud, Amazon Web Services, or Microsoft Azure. Here's a timeline view of the content we will be covering in this demo. Let us begin our hybrid cloud deployment by logging into NetApp Cloud Central, and followed by which we shall also log in to our choice of public cloud. In this demonstration, we shall use Amazon Web Services. US West 1, North California is going to be the region for this demonstration. Let us review the network settings within AWS. First, let's go to the VPC section. CVO is the name of the VPC that will be used for today's demonstration. All the instances that will be deployed within AWS and the network connections will happen through this VPC. We also have a subnet, that is a CVO public subnet, that is part of this VPC that we will use. And there is also a CVO public route table that is associated with the CVO public subnet. There's also an internet gateway that has been configured. CVO-GW is the name of the gateway. This will be used to enable access to or from the internet for all the instances within the subnets in our VPC. We shall also spin up a VPC endpoint to the S3 service. So we'll search for the S3 service. We'll create this as a gateway endpoint. So basically, this gateway endpoint would act as a target for our CVO public route in the route table for all traffic that is destined to the S3 service. Let's review the site-to-site VPN configuration. First, we have a customer gateway, which is from the on-premises FlexPod environment side. And then we also have a virtual private gateway sitting at the edge of our VPC, acting as a VPN concentrator on the AWS front. And we have a site-to-site VPN that has been created using both the customer gateway as well as the virtual private gateway. There's more information on the VPN configuration, the virtual private gateway and customer gateway with the IP address details. 2 tunnels, the first one is up, which is providing the necessary connectivity. And then we also have the static routes from the on-premises network side that are made available through this VPN configuration. We'll now go back to NetApp Cloud Manager and add our first working environment. We'll specify on-premises. And before we deploy CVO, we need to have a connector. So let's create a connector. We'll use AWS as the provider and go ahead and deploy the connector. So having chosen AWS, we also provide the access key and the secret key. The region is going to be US West 1, North California. We'll provide a name for our connector. Specify the correct VPC. In this case, it's going to be CVO. The subnet name is going to be CVO public. We've already created a key pair that we can use to connect. And then we create a new security group. We're going to keep the source type for HTTP, HTTPS, and SSH as anywhere. And quickly review the settings for our connector. There's also a code snippet that we can use if we would like to automate this process using Terraform. For now, we'll just proceed and add our connector. The connector deployment can take about 7 minutes to complete, and once it is done, we can start adding our working environments. First, we'll add an on-premises working environment. In this case, this ONTAP is part of the FlexPod converged infrastructure solution. We will provide the cluster management IP and credentials for the ONTAP system that is part of FlexPod. Cloud Manager discovers the cluster name, and the on-premises environment is now added. CVO can be deployed in 3 fashions: single node, high availability in single availability zone, and high availability in multi-availability zone. We'll start with single node. We'll go to add working environment, select AWS and select CVO single node, and proceed. We provide a name for this working environment and credentials for the CVO single node instance. There are a couple of optional services that we can choose to enable or disable. In this case, we will leave all the 3 as enabled. We stick to North California as our region, CVO as our VPC, and CVO public for the subnet. We'll choose an existing key pair for SSH authentication. We'll use the default option for data encryption and move on. There are a couple of charging methods. We'll choose freemium, but you can choose one that's more appropriate for you. The resources to deploy CVO come in pre-configured packages. You can choose one of these or even customize. We pick the POC package. An optional step is to create the volume and to choose the protocol. We can skip this and create the volume and choose the protocols at a later point after CVO is deployed. Storage efficiency has been left enabled. It's also the default setting. Tiering is also set to the defaults. We can now review the summary of what we're going to be deploying. Accept the terms and conditions. And in the overview, we can see all the specifications, the networking details, as well as the storage details that are going to be consumed from AWS to deploy the CVO single node instance. The deployment is initializing. We can enter the working environment. It takes about 25 minutes to complete the CVO deployment. We can go to timeline for a much more detailed view of the CVO deployment. We can now see a list of subtasks that are part of the different stages of CVO deployment, like checking the connectivity, creating the VSA working environment, and so on. Against each of these tasks and stages, we can also see the status, whether it is successful or it is pending. Right now, we can see that the CVO deployment has completed successfully. Let's go back to the canvas view for a visual representation. We can see that the FlexPod CVO single has been deployed successfully and also has a connection to AWS S3 for backup and restore. Let's enter the working environment of the CVO single deployment. We see this volume. This was an optional step, but it has been created. We shall now connect to the ONTAP storage system that is part of the on-premises FlexPod environment and create a volume by name FlexPod data. And once we have this volume created, we can then go ahead and create a replication relationship. So the volume has now been successfully created. We go back to Cloud Manager and drag and drop our on-premises ONTAP on top of the CVO instance. We will select the logical interfaces that should be used for the cluster peer setup. We will select the FlexPod data volume that we just created, and this is the volume that is going to be replicated over to CVO. The disk type, we leave it at general purpose SSD. Disable tiering, give a name for the destination volume in CVO. We can set a max limit for the data transfer for the replication from FlexPod to CVO. We'll use mirror as our replication policy and choose a daily schedule so the replication happens every day. Let's now review this replication relationship. We have the source and destination and also the destination volume specifications. On hitting go, the replication process is triggered. We can go back to the timeline view for a step-by-step detailed update on the replication relationship that we are trying to establish. On success, we just reload the browser tab and go back to the replication tab, and we can see the volume relationship shown here. The Canvas tab provides a visual representation of the replication between the on-premises FlexPod and Cloud Volumes ONTAP in AWS. Back in the replication section, the mirror state is now snap mirrored. We can also get additional details about this replication relationship by getting into information. The status is healthy. The volume information, source and destination is all shown. The transfer information is also displayed. We have now finished replicating data from FlexPod to a single node CVO. Next, let's do it with CVO in a HA configuration running in a single availability zone. We'll start by adding a working environment in AWS. CVO HA is the option that we're going to choose now. Click Next. Let's provide a name for this working environment and the credentials for this CVO deployment. We leave the optional features enabled, and in the deployment model, we will choose single availability zone. The region will remain as North California, US West 1. Our VPC is CVO and subnet is CVO public. We'll create a security group, and for connectivity and authentication, we're going to use a key pair that has already been created earlier. Encryption, we'll stick to default. No changes to the charging methods either. And for the packages also, we will choose POC. We'll skip the step of volume creation. We will review and approve all the settings and specifications for this single zone CVO HA deployment. On clicking OK, a working environment is added. It's initializing, as you can see on the screen here. Let's enter this working environment. It again takes about 30 minutes for this to complete. We go to the timeline view, and here again we can see a similar list of subtasks and the stages of the deployment of the CVO. Now the CVO deployment is successful. Back in Canvas, we can see the CVO single AZ HA deployment having a connection to S3 for backup. To set up a replication relationship, like in the earlier case, we can drag and drop the on-premises ONTAP system over to the CVO single AZ HA deployment. The next deployment mode for CVO is in a HA configuration, but across multiple availability zones. To showcase this, we will start fresh by adding another connector in a different region that has at least 3 availability zones. We shall choose AWS as the provider, enter the access and secret keys. The region in this case is going to be US East 1, North Virginia, which has at least 3 availability zones. A name for the connector. We choose an appropriate VPC, a subnet, and a key pair for authentication. Security group, again, a very similar approach to how we had done it earlier. We'll review the settings and deploy the connector. The only change is we are deploying this connector in US East 1, North Virginia. And once the connector is deployed, we can now proceed with the creation or deployment of CVO. Prior to deploying CVO, let's review the settings in AWS. Note that the region is now North Virginia. This is the VPC that we're going to use. In subnets, we see 6 subnets where each subnet is associated with 1 availability zone. So there are a total of 6 availability zones in North Virginia. We have an internet gateway. We have the route table created for all the 6 subnets. As you can see, all the 6 subnets are associated with this route table. We also have an endpoint for the S3 service. Now going back to Cloud Manager, we select the connector that is part of US East 1. We'll add a working environment. We'll select AWS, CVO ONTAP HA is what we're going to choose. We give the name for the working environment, credentials for the CVO instance, the optional services of data sense compliance, backup to cloud, and monitoring are going to be enabled. Here in the deployment model, we are going to choose the multiple availability zone as our deployment model. So once we choose multiple availability zone, we are asked for additional details about the node 1, node 2, and the mediator, where each of these are going to reside in different availability zones. Then we also provide the authentication details. In this case, we're going to use a key pair to connect to the nodes as well as the mediator. We shall now provide the floating IP addresses for management and data access. Ensure that these IPs are outside the CIDR blocks for all VPCs in this region. In the next step, we will select the route table that will include the routes to the floating IPs that we assigned earlier. Clients associated with this route table can access the CVO instance. Data encryption is left to defaults. We will select freemium as our charging method like we have done so far. For packages, we're going to choose one from these pre-configured packages. You also have the option to customize using the change configuration button on the top right. We'll use the POC option. In this example, skip the volume creation and review our settings for deploying this multi-AZ HA CVO deployment. Here are the networking details and the storage specifications. Start the deployment by clicking on Go. The working environment for multi-AZ HA is added. It's initializing. Enter the working environment. It takes about 30 minutes to complete the deployment, but we'll go to the timeline. And here, like we've seen so far, we can see a list of all the subtasks and under the different stages of the CVO deployment. Some of the subtasks are completed while some are still pending. This multi-AZ CVO HA deployment takes about 30 minutes to complete. In the interest of time, we are going to accelerate through that phase and head directly to the point where our CVO deployment is going to be complete. with this, we can now go to AWS and review the route table changes that the CVO deployment has done. So under route tables, we can see the routes being added for the floating IPs. To wrap up the network configuration in AWS, we will create a transit gateway that will help us in reaching the floating IPs from the outside world. We provide an autonomous system number for this transit gateway and create it. The status is initially pending, and once it is available, we can see the details of this transit gateway. We will now attach the VPC to this transit gateway. We select our transit gateway, select the attachment type as VPC, select our VPC and also the subnets that we would like to make part of this attachment. It's initially pending again, and once the attachment is successful, the status is available and we can see all the subnets, and the route tables are automatically populated under the transit gateway route table section. You can also see the route, and then we create a static route for the floating IP CIDR block and associate it with the attachment. At this point, we can now go back to Cloud Manager and enter the CVO working environment. We can verify the status of this deployment. We can see that the nodes and the mediator are all on and available. We can also launch the system manager of the CVO instance from Cloud Manager. We can use the credentials that we had provided during the deployment of the CVO instance and log into System Manager. A root volume for the storage virtual machine has been created. The storage virtual machine is currently running. We also see the aggregate details, and on the network we can see the broadcast domains and the network interfaces that are part of the default deployment. We can also see the Ethernet ports, and under cluster we can see an overview of the entire CVO cluster deployment and also the disk assignment. With the CVO deployment, we can now build a replication relationship with the on-premises FlexPod like we had showcased early on. We hope this was useful to you. Thank you for watching.